What are the ways in which natural resources can lead to conflict? What are the specific causal mechanisms that link the types of natural resources we just looked at, as well as the rents that they produce, tie into the leading to one of the greatest political challenges in the 20th and now 21st century of civil conflict, what we looked at over the course of this class. And I think the takeaway that I am left with is there is just an embarrassment of mechanisms. There's a lot of different ways the literature has found for natural resources to link to the risk of conflict, and we're going to talk a bit about some of these mechanisms now. And for those of you in the class, we're going to be talking about them in the workshop as well. How resources can affect conflict is different than regime stability and institutional quality that we've already touched on so far in this class. I really think there are a lot of interesting questions here that you can ask in your own research papers, or this is a topic that received more attention from basically 2004 to 2014 or 2015. It's interesting to think now in 2022 what other non-oil resources could actually matter in creating motivations for conflict. There are other resources besides oil that do matter in developing states, or ones in which there are conflicts. Of course, the danger is only looking at cases in which there is conflict, as we've talked about in the class, to what extent there are also other similar countries that haven't had conflict. The effects of natural resources on conflict is different than those that we've seen in the other earlier weeks in this class. The effects are non-monotonic, that you have those strong autocratic states that have largely been able to avoid conflict, and highly democratic states that deal with citizens' disagreements without leading to violence. It is kind of like with regime type, it's those anocratic middle kind of states that are more likely to have a relationship between natural resources and an increased risk of conflict. The other factor when trying to talk about natural resources, which kind of connects to one of the readings from last week's discussion of food production, in which as food production becomes more concentrated, you saw an increased risk of conflict. Here also location matters for the production of a natural resource, connecting to oil, which we're going to be talking about more in the next video. Whether oil production is offshore or onshore does matter. Onshore oil production is much more likely to lead to conflict than offshore production, because it's easier to target or be able to maintain control of. We'll see this in the South Sudan example of the Paloch oil fields. Compare that with Mozambique, in which most of the natural gas production is actually offshore in the northern part of the state. Also, whether the resource is central to the country, like with our discussion of urbanization in earlier weeks, that as resource is more concentrated in areas in which the government finds it easier to control, it might lead to a lesser risk of conflict than production that is in the boundary regions farther away from where most people live, or the sources of government power. That increases the risk of conflict. Turning now to a number of mechanisms, I think the Humphreys article does one of the best jobs I've seen in this literature of talking about a whole host of mechanisms all in one paper. It can get a little bit overwhelming at sometimes. The takeaway that I want to leave you with at the end of this video is that there's tons of different mechanisms for connecting natural resource production and conflict, depending on what actor you're looking at, as well as the time frame. So Humphreys connects natural resources conflict onset through a greedy rebels mechanism that with resources, greedy rebels are going to want to control the government or the part that actually has production. Think of the Cabinda part of Angola or Nigeria's oil production regions. Greedy outsider mechanisms. This connects to traditional international relations theories of how often developed states and their corporations can take advantage of developing states to be able to extract resources without paying for the full cost of the damage done in extracting those resources. International corporations have been brought to the courts and punished. Some withdrew from countries due to the benefits of these natural resources rents on autocratic states. An example of this would be a Canadian company, Talisman, that withdrew from Sudan during the 1990s due to the brutality of the civil war that was going on there and the leadership of Omar al-Bashir. Another mechanism that Humphreys mentioned is grievances by either the citizens or the elites, tying it back to the metaphor of the pie, that unequal distribution of resource of the pie can increase the chance of grievances. Another one by Michael Ross, who is quite heavy in this literature in influencing our understanding of the connections between natural resources and conflict, are feasibility and startup costs, booty futures, in which nascent rebel groups can promise outside corporations or governments to give them better deals on resource deals if they get startup costs to start their fight in the beginning. Laurent Kabila's would be an example of this in the DRC in getting outside assistance and support from Rwanda and others in exchange for preferential deals after getting control. Another mechanism would be the weak states approach, tying it together to the Fionn and Leighton reading, in which we've already talked about opportunities that are presented by governments that's too weak to be able to prevent rebels from trying to, or certain parts of the government from trying to take advantage of these resources. And I think the hardest one to kind of have an intuition for is the sparse trading networks framework that Humphreys talks about. I think it connects to those slides of export concentration in South Sudan compared to Australia, that if you have more networks for exports of different types of goods, you're at a lower risk of conflict because those different resources are likely to not all increase or decrease in price in the same way and in the same time. He also talks about the effects of conflict duration. Duration is not something we've really talked about that much in this class, but I think it is something that's incredibly important to understand the devastation that conflict can bring into a lot of developing states. It's fallen out of fashion. I need to try to think of something to try to contribute to that literature, because civil wars are dramatically longer than interstate wars. The average civil war lasts about 7 years, while the average interstate war lasts 10 or 11 months, last time I checked the data. And so having resources has a dramatic effect on increasing conflict duration, both because it increasing the feasibility of fighting a conflict. Both sides can be able to afford more weapons if they have control of some resources. It can change the military balance to make the governments and rebels to be of roughly increased or equal strength. It can split different groups, both the government and the rebel side, so there isn't a coherent body to negotiate the end of the conflict. Connecting it again to the Sudanese example, during the independence struggle that lasted decades from the 1950s In Sudan, Sudan's People Liberation Army splintered it in different factions, came back together. At one point, Riek Machar's group was aligning themselves with Bashir in the north, and then fell out, and then started fighting them again. So there's a lack of cohesiveness in groups that are associated with countries with natural resource exports. There's always a possibility of side rent payments to either elites or different segments of the population that one side or the other might try to control, which could also lead to increased duration. And the one way that it would actually shorten the duration potentially is through international interventions. If there is a conflict in a country that produces resources that are of interest to the international community, it can increase the chance of an intervention to be able to bring both sides to the table and reach a negotiated settlement, or to provide resources to one side or the other to be able to tip the balance of power. Countries that have natural resource conflicts are much more likely to end the conflict with one side winning as opposed to negotiated settlement, often because of the international assistance that they were able to receive. Other potential mechanisms that we talked about in the literature is declining rents can cause conflict. The dramatic decrease in resource rents to Venezuela, people were talking about the potential that could lead to conflict. Hasn't yet. As the risk of conflict increases, resource rents can decrease, raising the risk of endogeneity, that you have the established relationship of resource rents big, conflict big, but what could actually be driving that relationship is that that the risk of conflict can force some international corporations out, and that could decrease the rents, which could lead to that kind of Venezuela situation. Government weakness can cause both resource rents and conflict risk, that a weak state could be unable to help diversify the economy, which could also be a weak state that could be an increased risk of conflict. So there's spuriousness, something else. Government weakness is causing both a dependence on resource rents and conflict. And again, the last one is connections to the levels versus change, short-term versus long-term trends that we need to look at. As you write your own proposals and final essays, I think it's important for you to think about whether you're really focused on the short-term or the long-term, short-term shocks or longer-term differences across countries or within them that's really driving the relationships that you care about. Is it spikes or dips that really matter, or just how much overall those average resource exports are? So with that, there's a lot of potential mechanisms, and I think Humphreys points at a number of different ways to test it, and a number of different articles have made either implicit arguments for why they're estimating a relationship in a different way. I think Humphreys is really good at being explicit about what the causal stories are and the kind of tests that you need to actually make sure that what you're driving at is testable in the cases or the data that you're looking at. An example of the difference, or of there being an overdetermination, that you have a relationship and there's a bunch of explanations, you can't tell the difference between those different explanations effect, is the Collier and Hoffler versus Fearon and Leighton, both looking at GDP's relationship to conflict way back in week 2, that lower GDPs were associated with an increased risk in conflict. Collier and Hoffler connect GDP with greed. Fearon and Leighton tie it more to the weak states and opportunity argument. So I think the takeaway from these kind of arguments is that you need to try to be humble and try to be grounded in trying to explain what the connection is that you see between a particular type of resource and conflict, as well as what level of analysis, country level, state level, individual level, you really think the most important effects are. With that, I will wrap up this brief discussion of mechanisms in a comparative framework with natural resources. I want to turn now to a discussion of one specific resource, arguably the most important resource that we'll talk about today, though potentially if we teach the class if you teach the class in 40 or 50 years in a post-petroleum era, potentially whether that could have an interesting transition effect to increase or reducing the risk of oil as states transition. So let's turn to oil and conflict now.